So welcome everybody that's joined us for the workshop today. My name's Margaret Gold from Leiden University, where I run the Citizen Science Lab. And today we're going to be doing an introduction to the Leave No One Behind Toolkit, which has its intention to reach a more diverse community to be included in the activities of your Citizen Observatory. And as I've mentioned to everybody just before we started, there's a few portions of the webinar we're recording, which if you're watching is the portion that has been recorded. But as soon as we switch over to an interactive activity, we're going to be stopping the recording. So our agenda for today is to do a welcome and some introductions, to tell us a little bit about your own context and what you're interested in. That we're going to be talking about the Leave No One Behind concepts that are at the heart of the toolkit. And we'll have an interactive conversation about some of the specific concerns that we're bumping into in our own contexts or aspects of inclusion that you're thinking about. We'll then look at what's actually in the toolkit so far. We'll have a look at the tools that we've developing, and that's very much a work in progress. And we'll do an activity where we dive into some of those tools to take a look at them and see how they might serve us. And then we'll gather back again to feedback from having had breakout groups, looking at some of the aspects of those tools, and share thoughts and considerations for the next developments in the toolkit, what you might find useful or not useful, and what you feel might be missing. And we'll wrap up there. We've reserved 2 hours for ourselves to be able to have as much room for conversation as possible. But we might reach a natural end before that. We'll see what the pace of the conversation feels like as we go along. So with that, I'd like to welcome you and do some introductions. So I'll start with some introductions of what's in the toolkit itself. So as I mentioned, the Leave No One Behind toolkit is intended as an aid to considering inclusion and diversity in a citizen observatory. There's a stage at which we had language in there that's going to empower people, but of course it's not a toolkit. It's not going to be a magic trick to all of a sudden solving problems around diversity and inclusion, but rather offering as many methods or reflections or information about aspects of diversity and inclusion to aid our consideration of how we can make our activities as inclusive as possible. So it's about considering which groups you might be already reaching easily, but who might be being missed or harder to reach, how to connect with different types of groups, how to create an inclusive environment for people to be taking part, thinking in terms of who might be left behind, in terms of what's at stake for what you're investigating in your citizen observatory, who's experiencing a bigger impact from what it is that you're investigating. Ethical considerations about when you're working with diverse groups, things that you might want to take on board in your planning phase or preparing for outreach or activities, and also considering the justice of who has something at stake, especially when we're looking at different types of environmental monitoring. There's often very, very strong aspects of environmental justice in those topics. So considering how we can pick up those in our citizen observatory work. And this is all a work in progress, so we welcome your thoughts and your feedback and what might be missing, as well as sharing with you what we've been gathering so far. So with that, I'm going to stop recording in a moment so that we can talk freely amongst ourselves about who we are and what your citizen observatories are, and some of the considerations that you already have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see my record button. Where we were with the introductions, so that I can tell a little bit, I'll share a little bit more about some of the concepts that are contained in this particular toolkit, because we made a deliberate choice to use the concept of leave no one behind at the heart of it for these conversations and considerations. And it comes from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It's actually part of the pledge that the members of the United Nations made when they were putting together the Sustainable Development Goals. So all 18 of those goals and the targets defined within them, and within each of those targets, really specific indicators about how they would monitor progress, But there was really good awareness that when you're talking about development, there's already groups of people that are left behind economically speaking, or just actively discriminated against in different ways. And that in progressing towards these goals, that if you didn't have attention for it, there's a risk of these gaps getting even larger, or new groups being left behind. Whereas it should be seen as an opportunity to bring more people along to benefit from these developments. So they spent a fair bit of work understanding what this pledge would actually mean. So if you're pledging to not leave people behind in trying to achieve these goals, then how do you understand what are the factors behind it? So the Sustainable Development Group did a piece of work reaching out across their whole network with people that are working with various groups on the ground, and came up with this understanding of 5 different categories of how people can be caused to be left behind. So discrimination and socioeconomic status are the types of categories that we often find ourselves talking about. We talk about people that can have visible differences, cultural differences, linguistic differences that might be actively discriminated against, or people that have a socioeconomic situation that causes them to have a gap, or a difficulty in reaching. But there's quite a few other categories as well. So there's a deep piece of work behind understanding what these types of shocks are. And of course, they don't stand alone. They're very much intersectional. So another way of understanding these types of factors is and we tend to do this, and it's certainly with European funding, it's very vulnerable to this, almost a kind of a checkbox exercise of what groups have you reached out to or engaged with, as if people fall neatly into any of these kinds of categories. And we don't. As human beings, we're a mix of all of these things. So also these challenges of who might be discriminated against or left behind, or have a distance from the mainstream. It could be a range of these factors that are at play. So it's also fairly complex when we talk about these kinds of factors. So in defining these factors, the UNDP also talks about what can you therefore do to address them? So what are our levers in ensuring that no one is left behind? So they talk about really 3 main things. They talk about simply understanding who these groups might be, and what's the information or statistics or data about that. So simply examining what is happening, what's at play. Empowering those groups with pathways to engage, pathways to share voice, a better understanding of their contextual situation, what might be helped or addressed, and really empowering those groups themselves. And then enacting it, which is very much a more authoritative role that you can play, that you are making an action to integrate people, to be equity focused, to design policies to counter this, to stage interventions to bring people in, and to budget for these things. So these 3 levers really also assume different things about what your role might be. In many cases, we're therefore talking about people with a top-down role or a leadership role. And many of us in the Citizen Observatories in which we're engaged, we might be playing that kind of a leader role. It might be from a stable institution that we're able to engage people, or it might be from a funded project, having funding ourselves to be able to engage, or from a particular authority that has a mandate on that topic, somebody from a city or from a province, for example. So these are things that we might have in our own hands. But so many of our citizen observatories are grassroots initiatives. They're coming from a group of concerned citizens that they themselves are taking action. And then it's a different kind of approach that we might consider about how do you think about who might be being missed, or the reasons that people might be being left behind. So this is something that we want to pay attention to into the toolkit, is thinking about who has a degree of responsibility of attention for being inclusive, and who's able to act, or in what way are you able to act on that awareness that of being the need to be more inclusive or diverse. And in the Citizen Science Project, the CitiObs project, we're looking at 3 main bodies of actors in Citizen Observatories when we're talking about data and insights and identified needs and um, contextual situations. This knowledge coming from citizens and communities that are experiencing or observing and are involved in gathering data and gathering evidence, and then this is taken to a place or a body or a group where this can be assessed and analyzed, which could still be completely in the hands of citizens and communities doing that data analysis and doing that, turning that into knowledge or understanding. There can be new parties that are involved as data scientists or data aggregators or environmental scientists. There's other roles that might come in. And then ultimately, if we're working towards action based on these insights and knowledge, we're often taking that to policymakers or governance or decision makers of various types. And sometimes it's once again still in the hands of citizens and communities coming up with their own collective actions, coming up with their own individual actions that might be taken, but for really scaling up and having larger impact, especially on the types of environmental factors that many of us are looking at. You need policymakers in this mix as well, as Jean-Paul also so beautifully explained, and the kinds of frictions between these different ways of acting and the different worlds in which you're acting. So I'd like to once again head into a collective conversation with each other. So in a moment, I'll stop recording so that we can speak freely, thinking about who some of these stakeholders are, whether we ourselves are sometimes the actors or stakeholders who are at the action side, but also thinking about who has something at stake in the outcome of our activities. And this is a different type of stakeholder, which might be some of the people that we miss. So in the example of air quality, which has such an obvious health impact, a negative health impact, who are the people that are perhaps most vulnerable to these negative health impacts? And that could be because air pollution in their areas is higher, or they themselves have a health vulnerability to it. You can think of, for example, very young people whose lungs are still developing, or elderly people whose lungs are not as strong or robust, or people that already have a health issue with their lungs, that they might be unequally impacted. So they are clearly a group that have something at stake. So we are thinking of both internal and external stakeholders in this way, people that have the ability to act and people that also have something at stake. So with that, I'm going to take us back to our Mira board together, where we can have a conversation about who our stakeholders are and who we're actively seeking to engage with, perhaps the people that have something at stake, or perhaps the people that have an ability to act, or decision makers if it's a different type. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen again so I can see the stop record button. And now I'm sharing my slides again. To say a little bit more about where we're at in developing this toolkit, because we've described these very complex situations, and sometimes it might be the participatory dynamics toolkit that we might want to dive into, or the co-creation action toolkit that we might dive into. These are clearly all very closely related. And the Leave No One Behind toolkit, although we're starting to find lots of beautiful resources about working with specific groups and specific needs for that, and I can point to you later to where we're trying to signpost those. For example, working with groups that are hard of hearing, there's some lovely resources that already exist. But what we've done with the Leave No One Behind toolkit is really provided materials for reflection on what the dynamics might be, or what the local case might be, or who people with something at stake being missed in the process might be, and then how to go about understanding what their needs might be for being involved, because we don't want to place the burden of participation on their shoulders if they're already in a vulnerable situation. They might simply not have the bandwidth to engage with things like this. If other issues are way more important, such as holding down a job, putting food on the table, any of these other kinds of issues, those are going to have much bigger priority. And then it can be up to us to find other ways for people's voice and situation to be included without putting the task of a lot of activities on their shoulders as something else for them to do. We can remove these burdens, but to understand them, there's a lot of reflection and understanding that needs to go on. So this is the nature of the Leave No One Behind Toolkit at the moment. It's consists of a slide deck with a lot of materials that can be used in workshops to guide a conversation with any of the groups that you might be working together with. Within that, some very specific methodologies for facilitated discussion or reflection, and then the online toolkit, which has some signposting interface to other resources that might be helpful, where we collected as many as we could find so far that might be relevant to your cases. So I'll start with the Leave No One Behind slide deck, which you can find at the Zenodo link that's provided there on this slide. And I can make sure everybody has a copy of these slides later as well. We'll make sure that these are distributed to everybody that's joining us at the workshops or anybody that would like to receive a copy later. So that Zenodo link goes to a current version of the slide deck, which has some slides talking about what the Leave No One Behind concept is, concepts about diversity and inclusion. And I'll give you just a little bit of a flavor here. I introduced these 5 factors that the UNDP has determined cause people to be left behind. And then on the basis of each of these, a little bit of a deeper dive. So a definition of what does discrimination mean? And this is, for example, the definition the law in the United Kingdom in terms of protecting people against discrimination and a very specific definition of what discrimination means. Many of our national bodies of law will have a definition along these lines. And when they're phrased in that way, then they're often this kind of a checkboxing exercise of these different categories of demographics that people can get described by. So when we're talking about discrimination, we're often looking at these types of categories. And this is very closely related to socio-economic status as well. So this is another of the factors of why people might be left behind. Simply having lower economic ability to access various things, inability to pay for things, or distance from where these are offered or made available. And both of these are areas that we most commonly think about when we think about inclusion or diversity and who's able to participate. And this is a frame of reference that you might be familiar with already, that equality gives everybody the same size box, but that might not be in keeping with the actual needs or the different contexts of the group. So instead, we often use the word equity, which is a different distribution of boxes, but then everybody has the ability to look over the fence. So this is recognizing that the needs might be very different based on those different contexts. But we can go even further with this particular baseball game metaphor, where you pay attention to removing barriers of participation. And actually, when we're talking about our citizen observatories, when we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about depending on the level of participation that's might be available to the person, the opportunity to participate or be included, even if it's something as simple as dialogue or a social moment to share stories and share insights with the aim of aiding understanding, and having a voice be included as a respected partner, or acknowledgement as somebody that has something at stake. So these are really handy terms to have a feeling for, to already help shift our thinking towards who might be left out and how to address that in an equitable fashion, but actually remove barriers to participation and find ways to include that are fitting with the person and what they're able to do. And then the next part, which I'm just going to touch on briefly, it's actually the third aspect of the CitiObs toolkit, but it's very much a work in progress. Our first gathering of the kinds of resources that might be useful and how to guide people towards using the toolkit, we took a question-driven approach. So right now it's in the form of a Git book. It's online at the URL that's provided on this slide. And this is what the interface looks like on the signposted guidance. We've got some questions at the top level to help you drive deeper into the deeper material. So if you're wanting to know what does leave no one behind mean, that's the box you can click on, and it gives you much more information about the concept. How can we engage with the concepts of equity, diversity, and inclusion takes you into a deeper understanding of what those terms mean, what they're referring to, some materials for engaging with those topics. Some considerations of how to be ethical in your efforts to reach out and engage, with some really nice guidelines that exist about how to consider ethics in the planning phase when you're running an activity or running outreach actions. In the wrap-up phase, how to consider ethics at all of those phases. And engaging with specific communities or groups. We've been able to signpost quite a few things we found that are about working with specific groups. So, for example, with youth groups, in the context of mental health. And we continue to gather as many of those as we find. So anything you point us to, we'll be very happy to add those here. So this is an online toolkit that's still very much a work in progress. Where I'd like to spend time with you primarily today, and this will be our next interactive activity and the deeper one for our workshop together, is to take a look at some of the reflection and discussion methods that we've been gathering so far. And these can be found also on the online toolkit, but I've shared quite a number of them on our Miro board that we're going to move to in a moment to have an interactive conversation again. And the first one that I'll highlight, and we can use this to have a conversation together in the group before we do some breakout groups looking at individual methods. This is a very specific method, which is a nice one for considering physical access or accessibility of something that you're organizing within your Citizen Observatory. So if you think in terms of a group that you might not typically be reaching or you'd like to reach, but there haven't been joining you so far, the exercise works by first thinking of all of the ways to actively block them, to make it absolutely impossible for them to participate in the activity that you're considering. And then we flip that and we think about how we remove all of those obstacles. So I'm going to stop sharing so that we can spend a little bit of time on that. But before I do, I'd like to not leave you hanging with how you might address some of these considerations. So there's already some beautiful pieces of work about how to reach out to groups of people that are underserved. So I do want to leave you with these particular recommendations because they're so common sense once you see them listed, but they're really handy checklists to have in mind. And most of them, they'll seem very clear to you as you read them, as you go on the screen. But one of them I'm going to highlight, which is the openness paradox, which is what happens in your brain if somebody tells you, we can talk about anything you want to talk about. We can do anything you want. And then that's too big. There's no place to start. So having a really specific, clear agenda, and then giving permission to deviate and permission to raise whatever comes up later, is much easier for people to engage with, and still find the way to share what they would like to share. But if you start with too big, too open, we can do whatever you want, then people often get stuck, or there'll just be one strong voice that takes everything off in one direction instead of it being a balanced group. And then working with communities that really should have a longevity and the long-term sustaining of that activity in mind. So having shared those, I'm going to pause here and stop sharing and stop recording so that we can go to let's find my stop recording button.